The dream did not arrive like a dream. It arrived like memory. No one remembered falling asleep into it. No one remembered the shifting nonsense that usually comes before the mind gives up and lets impossible things feel normal. People woke with the same sensation you get after visiting a place that mattered, somewhere you are certain you stood before, even if logic insists you haven't. They woke with the taste of cold air in their mouths, with the impression of blue-white light behind their eyes, and with one name pressing against their thoughts like a word they had always known. Vera. By sunrise, children in Mumbai were drawing the same skyline as engineers in Sao Paulo. A bus driver in Lagos called into a radio station and described a narrow bridge suspended above Blackwater, only to hear the host go silent and say she had crossed that bridge too. Surgeons in Berlin paused over coffee because all of them could describe the same station clock, frozen at 3:17. Its hands fused together as though time itself had given up inside that city. Millions of people could name streets that had never existed, fountains that spilled upward instead of down, towers cut with windows that looked inward toward stars. There was no official explanation the first few hours, only panic wrapped in fascination. News anchors tried to stay composed while admitting, on air, that they had seen it too. Religious leaders called it warning, revelation, judgment, invitation. Psychologists talked about mass suggestion until they were forced to admit the timelines made no sense. Entire populations had dreamed it simultaneously, including people asleep on planes, people under sedation, people in prison isolation, newborn mothers collapsing for 40 minutes in hospital beds. Even those who claimed not a dream said they woke with fragments of Vera embedded in them like splinters of another life. But it was not just a city that unsettled the world. It was the knowledge. People remembered things they had never learned, not vague intuitions, specifics, pieces of mathematics with no published origin, a symbol system that appeared in thousands of notebooks before linguists could identify a pattern. Children who had never studied astronomy were able to point to a region of the sky and say, with terrifying certainty, that something used to be there. Mechanics, farmers, actors, teachers, all waking with disconnected shards of understanding that meant nothing on their own and yet felt engineered to fit together. That was what drew Mara Ellison into the story before noon. She worked in Chicago as an archival researcher for the museum campus, the sort of job that trained a person to distrust spectacle and pay attention to details everyone else stepped over. By 8 in the morning, her inbox was unusable. By 9, her phone was vibrating with messages from colleagues, ex-classmates, and her younger brother, Jonah, who simply wrote, "Tell me you saw the stairwell too." She had. In the dream, there had been a stairwell descending beneath the city. No handrails, just stone steps worn down at the center, spiraling below Vera into a darkness that did not feel empty. She remembered standing at the top of it with 6 other figures nearby, though in the dream their faces were turned away. She remembered the certainty that if she went down, she would not come back as the same person. By noon, governments were holding emergency briefings. Markets dipped. Flights were delayed because air traffic controllers kept losing focus, staring at scraps of paper where they had unconsciously drawn the same crescent-shaped plaza. That was when Mara received a message from a woman she hadn't spoken to in 11 years. Dr. Amina Al-Khatib, astrophysicist, former friend, last person Mara had trusted enough to tell the truth when both of them were 23 and afraid of wasting their lives. The message was painfully simple. "I know what the clock means. I'm in town tonight. Meet me." Mara almost ignored it. Then Jonah called, sounding unlike himself. "There are others," he said, "people who remember more than the rest of us. I'm one of them." Jonah was not a dramatic person. He taught middle school earth science and considered buying expensive pens a reckless decision. If his voice had that edge in it, something was wrong. They met that evening in a quiet conference room borrowed from a museum. The city outside still vibrating with sirens and commentary, and the eerie intimacy of strangers looking at one another like survivors of the same accident. Amina arrived first, tall and composed in the way of people who have learned to seal panic behind precision. Jonah came with a woman named Lynn Tran, a cognitive neurologist from Northwestern Memorial, and an amateur radio operator from Gary named Mateo Alvarez, who had spent the entire day listening to static patterns that he claimed weren't static at all. There was no grand introduction. They sat around a table under fluorescent lights, carrying the same strain in their faces. Amina opened a notebook and turned it around. On the page was a sequence of symbols, delicate and angular, each one familiar enough that Mara felt a chill before she understood why. The language from the dream. I wrote these down the second I woke up, Amina said. Then I checked my phone. 3 of my colleagues in different countries sent me the exact same sequence. Not similar. Exact. I think it's coordinates. Coordinates to where? Jonah asked. Amina looked at him. That's the problem. Not where. When. The room went still. Lynn leaned forward and slid a tablet across the table. It showed brain scans collected that morning from volunteers who reported unusually vivid memories of Vera. The hippocampus activation patterns were wrong. Not abnormal in the sense of disease, but wrong in the sense that the brain was responding to the dream as if it had stored an autobiographical event. Real memory, not imagined narrative. Our brains don't fully distinguish between vivid experience and recollection, Lynn said, but this is beyond that. The encoding signatures are consistent with lived events. It's as though something inserted memory without going through perception first. Mateo gave a humorless laugh. You say that like it's impossible. It should be, Lynn said. Mara stared at the page. Outside the conference room, reporters were probably talking about mass psychosis and social contagion and digital manipulation. Inside, none of those explanations survived contact with what was in front of them. So why us? She asked. Why do we remember more? Jonah answered before anyone else could. Because in the dream, we were there together. Our brains don't fully distinguish between vivid experience and recollection, Lynn said, but this is beyond that. The encoding signatures are consistent with lived events. It's as though something inserted memory without going through perception first. Mateo gave a humorless laugh. You say that like it's impossible. It should be, Lynn said. Mara stared at the page. Outside the conference room, reporters were probably talking about mass psychosis and social contagion and digital manipulation. Inside, none of those explanations survived contact with what was in front of them. So why us? She asked. Why do we remember more? Jonah answered before anyone else could. Because in the dream, we were there together. Silence settled over the group in a different way then, more intimate and more frightening. Mara searched her own memory again and found the truth of it. The 6 shadowed figures near the stairwell. One had Jonah's slouch. One had Amina's stillness. Another, Mateo's broad shoulders. Their faces had been hidden, but their presence had not. Amina tapped the clock she had drawn in the margin. 3:17. This time appears everywhere in the data people are posting. On walls. On station signs. On broken wristwatches. I cross-checked it with pulsar timing arrays, deep sky survey logs, archived transit events. 3 years ago, on March 17th, there was an anomaly recorded in a cold region just beyond the Oort cloud's projected influence. It was dismissed as instrumentation noise because it didn't repeat, but the signal had structure. Mateo pulled a recorder from his jacket and set it on the table. I've been hearing the same structure all day buried in shortwave, not on a frequency. Beneath one, like something riding the noise floor. Listen. He played it. At first it was only hiss. Then a pulse emerged, not exactly sound and not exactly rhythm, but pattern enough that Mara felt recognition before she understood it. A sequence of long and short intervals. A pause. 3 descending tones. Jonah went pale. That's the tram line, he said. Nobody understood. In the dream, Jonah explained, there had been a tram running through the eastern quarter of Vera. He remembered waiting beside it, hearing the arrival chime over and over. The tones on Mateo's recorder matched it perfectly. You're saying a city that doesn't exist left behind its transit sounds and radio noise, Lynn said. I'm saying maybe it does exist, Mateo replied, "and we're the part that doesn't fit." The investigation did not become official. It became necessary. Over the next 4 days, while the world argued itself into camps of believers and cynics, the five of them built a private map from public obsession. Billions of accounts, millions of sketches, thousands of recordings. They sorted for repeating details, for elements too obscure to spread by imitation. Mara handled the visual archive. She found that nearly every version of Vera placed a stairwell beneath a circular plaza ringed by 12 stone figures with featureless faces. Lynn tracked neurological reports and discovered that people who remembered the city most clearly also shared one more trait. Each had experienced a sudden, unexplained nosebleed at exactly 3:17 a.m. local time on the night of the dream. Mateo hunted the hidden signal. Amina ran numbers until she stopped sleeping. Jonah did what he always did when the world stopped making sense. He made models. He built Vera from memory using cardboard, wire, and the patient logic of a teacher who knew that understanding begins in the hands. As the miniature city took shape on the museum table, something impossible happened. None of them had to correct each other. Mara would add an archway, and Amina would nod. Jonah would place a narrow observatory at the northern edge, and Lynn would say the staircase belonged behind it. Mateo inserted 3 small towers beside the Blackwater Canal, and nobody questioned it because they had all seen those towers. It was like reconstructing the ruins of somewhere they had truly lived. On the 5th night, Amina found the pattern, not in the sky, in time. The symbols from the dream did not point to spatial coordinates at all. They describe a relationship between rotational frames, a kind of temporal alignment that could occur when gravitational fields, planetary motion, and a source of external signal interference overlapped in a precise way. It should have been useless. The Earth did not possess conditions strong enough for anything dramatic to happen, unless, Amina said quietly, something is amplifying from the outside. She brought up an old survey map of the South Atlantic seafloor, then a newer one, still partly classified, until it leaked that morning as governments everywhere lost their grip on secrecy. In a trench west of Tristan da Cunha, sensors had detected a geometric structure at impossible depth, not a shipwreck, not volcanic basalt, something symmetrical buried beneath sediment, emitting a low electromagnetic pulse synchronized globally at 317 universal reference offset. Mara felt the room tighten around that fact. An object? She asked. Amina nodded. Or a machine. Mateo looked almost offended by the word almost. The dream wasn't random, he said. It was a handshake. Lynn shook her head, but only because the alternatives were worse. If something made contact, why through dreams? Why not speech? Why not images on screens? Why not anything clearer? Because dreams are the only language every human already speaks, Mara said. Everyone looked at her. She did not know where the thought had come from. Or rather, she did know, and that was the part she did not want to say aloud. Vera had taught it to her. The city that did not exist had left an answer in her like a folded note. By then, governments were mobilizing ships. Conspiracy channels were multiplying by the hour. Pilgrims had begun traveling to places they believed resembled pieces of the dream. Markets for sleep suppressants exploded. So did underground groups trying to induce the dream again by any means they could manage. Humanity had been split open by a shared secret and was bleeding meaning into everything. The 5 of them had one advantage over everyone else. They knew where the stairwell was. Not physically, structurally. Mara realized that while studying hundreds of drawings of the plaza, the stairwell was never centered. It was always offset by the same angle from the clock tower, always aligned with the moon as seen from the city in the dream. But the moon over Vera had been wrong. Too large, scarred differently. Not Earth's moon, a reference moon, a marker. Amina converted the angle into a geometric transformation on the seafloor coordinates. The result landed not on the trench itself, but on an inland site in Argentina, a dry plateau where an observatory had been abandoned in the 1990s after a landslide. Satellite images now showed unusual thermal activity there. Within 18 hours, without permission, and without a plan sturdy enough to deserve a word. They were on a military charter flight full of scientists who still avoided saying dream out loud. The plateau felt wrong the moment they stepped onto it. Not haunted, not cursed. Misplaced. The air carried that same cold taste from the dream, metallic and winter clean. Beneath the collapsed observatory dome, rescue teams had uncovered a shaft hidden under 6 meters of rock and concrete. Stone steps, worn down at the center, descending into darkness. No one had been allowed below yet. Equipment failed when lowered past a certain depth. Cameras returned snow. Sensors looped back impossible readings, sometimes reporting that the shaft was only 60 feet deep, sometimes 6 miles, once briefly suggesting it opened into vacuum. Mara stood at the edge and felt a wave of certainty so strong it nearly buckled her knees. "I've been here," she whispered. Jonah touched her shoulder. "Me too." The military wanted procedure, isolation, hazmat, remote probes, but procedure had already failed, and the 5 of them had become a category no protocol knew how to process. People who had seen the place before seeing it. People who knew there would be 12 landings and a door at the bottom, and a wall to the left bearing the same angular script found in the shared dream. They were right. Every detail matched. By the time they reached the door, no one above could hear them anymore. Their radios were dead. The flashlight beams looked dim and uncertain, as though the dark around them had density. On the wall, the script shimmered faintly. Mara touched it. The world changed without moving. For one impossible second, she was standing in Vera beneath a sky, full of slow-turning constellations she could almost name. The Blackwater Canal reflected lights from towers that curved inward like cupped hands. She heard footsteps, many footsteps, and distant voices speaking the dream language not with alien strangeness but with the warmth of routine. A lived-in city, a remembered city, a real city. Then the vision narrowed and she understood. Vera was not a place waiting somewhere in the universe. It was a place that had already been lost. The knowledge came in a rush shared by all of them at once, the way the dream had been shared. Not words, structure, meaning. Vera had belonged to another branch of intelligence, not human, and not entirely separate, a civilization that had discovered too late that consciousness could outlive worlds if encoded correctly. Faced with extinction, they had built a bridge not through space, but through minds capable of dream and memory. They sent themselves forward as a pattern, searching for a species similar enough to receive them, not to invade, to be remembered, because places die twice, once when they are destroyed, and again when there is no one left who knows they existed. The door opened inward. Beyond it was no city, no army of waiting ghosts, no machine glowing with easy answers. Only a chamber lined with black stone and a sphere suspended at its center, dark as deep water, breathing with faint internal light. A memorial engine, a library built from consciousness. The object beneath the Atlantic was its twin, the transmitter. The dream had been the first successful contact after ages of trying. Lynn was crying before she knew she was crying. Mateo stood absolutely still, his face emptied by awe. Jonah laughed once under his breath, the sound of a man breaking under beauty instead of fear. Amina stepped toward the sphere with reverence, so careful it looked like grief. Mara saw then what the others were beginning to see. The shared knowledge left inside humanity was not random. It was a map, yes, but also an invitation, a request to carry Vera forward, to learn its history, to let a vanished civilization continue not in flesh or empire, but in memory distributed across billions of living minds. The most human archive ever made would not be written in stone or code. It would be remembered together. When the second dream came 3 nights later, the world was ready for nothing and received it anyway. This time there was no panic. People entered sleep, knowing they would go somewhere beyond ordinary explanation. They found Vera again, clearer now, walking its bridges and plazas with a tenderness reserved for endangered things. They saw families that had once lived there, gardens growing under artificial moons, halls of music shaped for ears unlike ours and yet beautiful to us all. They learned piece by piece, the story of a civilization that had crossed extinction by becoming unforgettable. The old arguments did not vanish. Governments still competed. Religion still interpreted. Corporations still tried to monetize revelation, because humanity remains itself even when staring into the impossible. But something fundamental shifted. For the first time in recorded history, every person on Earth carried the same sacred place in memory, a city none of us could visit, and all of us somehow had. A place that didn't exist. A place that had existed. A place that now depended on being held inside minds fragile enough to forget birthdays, names, promises, yet vast enough to shelter the dead. Months later, when people asked Mara what it felt like to be among the first to descend the stairwell, she never described the fear. She never talked about the dead radios or the dark, or the way reality seemed to thin near that chamber under the plateau. She told them the truth as simply as she could. It felt like discovering that memory is larger than a single species. The children understood it first. They always do. They stopped asking whether Vera was real and started asking what its people were like, what they loved, what they lost, why they chose dreams instead of war, why they trusted strangers in the future to keep them alive. Adults were slower. Adults kept circling back to proof, to mechanism, to ownership. But even they began to soften under the weight of a mystery that had chosen not to conquer us, only to be known by us. And late at night, when the world grew quiet enough for the old ache of being alive to return, Mara sometimes thought about the first dream before anyone knew what it meant. She thought about billions of strangers waking with the same city behind their eyes. She thought about how lonely the universe had seemed before that morning, how confidently humanity had believed that intelligence would announce itself with power, with fire, with language shouted across the stars. Instead, it had come to us in the most intimate way possible. A dream shared by everyone. A city placed gently into our care. And somewhere beyond language, beyond astronomy, beyond the narrow border of human history, an extinct people had solved the oldest fear any civilization can have. They had found a way not to survive, but something stranger. They had found a way to be missed by those who had never met them,